There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
It's the 17th of September 2004. After 4 years of dating, 52-year-old Des Campbell and 49-year-old Janet Fisicaro are tying the knot. They'll make their vows in a simple and stylish garden ceremony at the River Gallery Inn, nestled along the bank of the Murray River in the northern Victorian town of Echuca. Civil celebrant Jennifer Whelan is officiating the day, but all isn't quite as it seems. Since meeting the pair, she thinks there's something of a mismatch. Des has planned the day according entirely to his own tastes and with little concern, she thinks, for Janet's preferences. Janet seems like a kind and humble woman, but the celebrant can't help but notice how Des, her soon-to-be husband, leers at other women in close proximity. Her instincts tell her that something is very wrong, but Jennifer Whelan is there to do a job, which she carries out with as much professionalism as she can muster as the ceremony gets underway.
Welcome, family and friends. We've come together today to witness the promises in marriage of Des Campbell and Janet Fisicaro.
Despite Janet's keenness to tie the knot, there doesn't really seem to be much physical contact between the soon-to-be newlyweds. No holding hands, no longing gazes or embraces, and perhaps most bizarrely, no photographer. Not a single image taken of Des in his expensive tailored suit, or his bride Janet with her bouquet of imported Singapore orchids, and her formal cream suit made by the local dressmaker months earlier.
You may now kiss the bride.
Aside from the bride and groom, there are only 3 people in attendance. The resort managers act as the 2 necessary witnesses, and after the marriage certificate is signed, they and Jennifer join Des and Janet for a lavish wedding breakfast. Thousands of dollars worth of canapes and vintage French champagne are consumed, and then within a couple of hours, it's all over. The whole day had struck the 3 guests in attendance almost as if Des Campbell didn't want anyone else to know about it. And after a night in the hotel's most expensive suite, the newlyweds returned to their life in Deniliquin, to separate houses and largely separate lives. But Des needed Janet to straighten a few things out before they could begin their next chapter. Priority number 1, that Janet sort out her extensive estate and her last will and testament to ensure that Des was a beneficiary and executor.
Digging murderer Des Campbell will spend at least 24 years in jail for pushing his wife Janet off a cliff.
The offender took the life of an outgoing, generous, warm-hearted and somewhat naive, middle-aged country woman as soon as it became clear that he had obtained as much financial advantage as he could from the relationship. The circumstances under which Janet Campbell met her death demonstrate the offender's sustained callousness towards her for nothing more than monetary gain.
I'm Emma Gillespie, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In 2010, Des Campbell was found guilty of murdering his wife, Janet Fisicaro. The pair had only been married 6 months when they embarked on a camping trip in the Royal National Park south of Sydney. A trip that sadly only Des would survive. Initially, he told police that Janet had fallen from a 50-metre cliff in a tragic accident. But investigators would soon come to realise that the 49-year-old hadn't fallen at all. She had in fact been pushed to her death by a man who stood to gain hundreds of thousands of dollars from her estate. Our guest today, Ian Shaw, is a prolific author of true crime and narrative non-fiction. He's researched this case extensively and joins us today in the hopes of ensuring the world is made aware of Des Campbell's manipulations and the insidious subculture of exploitation that preys on vulnerable singles in the online dating community to this day. Ian, let's start back in the year 2000. What was Deniliquin like at that time, and how did a man called Des Campbell end up living there?
Deniliquin in 2000 was like a lot of Australian country towns, a population, I guess, around 7,000, relied very heavily on the area's irrigation and rice farms. And like just about every town that size in Australia, there were things that happened a bit below the surface. It was a part of a much larger area where marijuana was grown. So there was a subculture of dealers and drug runners, and it was always there just below the surface. And around that time, there were 3 particularly horrendous murders of Deniliquin residents, a married couple and the woman's son from her first marriage. And they were clearly execution-style murders, a single shot to the head for each of them. The father, Stephen, had a lot of bullet wounds in his legs, and it appears that they were a message that you can run but you can't hide type thing. So Des Campbell arrived there in the wake of this triple murder that has never been solved as a paramedic, an ambulanceman, and he had a very colourful background, and it took the locals several months to work out who he was, and by the time they did work out who he was already causing mischief.
What sort of mischief was he causing?
He was basically a serial womanizer. He had a very checkered background, and the longer he was in Deniliquin, the more that background came to be known. And part of it was this sequence of serial girlfriends who all reported pretty much the same thing, that he was after their money, that he'd love them and leave them, that he was a charming character most of the time, but he had a violent temper. And it so happened that one of his previous girlfriends turned up in Deniliquin to live with him. That didn't last very long at all, and her story was quite interesting. She was an English policeman, and Des himself had been a policeman, an officer in the Australian Army in charge of a parachute platoon. He had left Victoria Police under a cloud over a fairly amateurish attempt at an insurance fraud. He also was involved in, when he was in the drug squad, with very questionable dealings with people related to the drug trade. He resigned from Victoria Police rather than be sacked. And next thing, he turned up in the United Kingdom, where he joined the police in Surrey and worked in a small village there. He met the wife of one of his fellow officers, in fact, a traffic warden named June Ingham, and they started an affair. He convinced her to leave her husband, to come to Australia, to set up house with him, and painted this rosy picture of the future. He drove from Deniliquin to Tullamarine Airport in Melbourne to pick her up, and had booked into the airport motel, and said to her after they'd unpacked and everything, well, how did the settlement with your former husband go? Did you get the money? And she said yes. And he said, how much? And she said $50,000. And he was just furious. And basically he told her to pack her bags, put them in the boot of the car, drove down the Tullamarine freeway, I don't know how far, stopped, opened the boot, chucked the suitcase on the side of the road, opened the door for her, said, get out, and drove off. There's no saving grace to this story, but he did return later, pick her up, took her back and apologised profusely and said he was in shock because he actually thought she would bring enough money to set them up for life and yada, yada, yada. She accompanied him back to Deniliquin, and at one stage, I don't think they'd been there too long, might have been 3 months, perhaps more. She wanted to go back to England to finally settle all her affairs from the divorce and the sale of the house and those kind of things. She went back, and while she was back in England, got a text message from Des Campbell saying, "You dropped." She was heartbroken, and one of the few who wasn't prepared to take it lying down. She harboured the dream that one day she'd get even with him, or at least let him know how much hurt, how much pain she suffered because of his actions. Meanwhile, back in Deniliquin, Des was cutting a bit of a swathe through the local female community. He gained quite a strong reputation as someone who would hang out at the bowling club and the RSL, and they used to have nights. The terminology was grab a granny night, and there were nights where single women of all ages would go along. There'd be live music or there'd be some kind of entertainment. Des would turn up at those and try and pick up the wealthier older women. He continued to do that, gaining a reputation, all the while behaving quite bizarrely. He loved taking films and still photos of his sexual partners, these women he picked up, and would show them to other people where he worked, the other ambulance paramedics, and most of them were put off by it. The women who worked there, whether they were paramedics themselves or nurses at the Deniliquin hospital, were physically not revolted, but seemed to pick up that the guy was just a very, very sleazy, ordinary character, and would step back from him, except for one woman, a woman named Janet Fisicaro.
So Janet Fisicaro had lived in Deniliquin her whole life, unlike Des. What can you tell me about her? Where was Janet at in her life before she met Des?
Yeah, Janet's family had lived in Deniliquin and surrounds for lots of years. She came from a very close-knit family. She had two sisters and a brother. They all lived in or around Deniliquin. And when she was quite young, she met an older man named Frank Fisicaro, who was descended from Italians who'd moved to the area in the 1930s. And he was a wonderful man. He was a very successful farmer. He was a loving husband. They married early 80s, had one son. Then I think about 13, 14 years into the marriage, he suffered a massive heart attack and died. He left everything to Janet, and everything included a very productive farm and a house, and her son Stephen was too young to take over the farm. She had no interest in the farm herself or in farming herself, so she sold it and bought a home in Deniliquin.
Where did the sale of the property leave her financially?
The sale of the family property, the family farm, left Janet a very wealthy woman by standards, 25 years ago. The property itself realised almost $800,000. There were other interests that Frank Fisicaro had that probably added another $100,000. So she was pretty much a millionaire after all the assets were disposed of. She used part of that money to buy a house in Deniliquin, moved into the new home with her son, and it was not far from her sisters, her brother, and particularly her mother, and she was very close to her mother. She worked at the Deniliquin hospital as a cleaning lady / clerical, jack of all trades or Jill of all trades. And while she was there, she met Des Campbell. I suspect she'd heard others talking about him and his behaviour, but he paid particular attention to her. Not when people were around. He always made certain it was just the two of them. And eventually she found herself falling in love with Des, which was precisely what he wanted. So while Des still had other girlfriends, he managed to convince Janet that she was the one and that they should spend the rest of their life together.
What drew them, to each other? Was it purely this financial motivation for Des? And what about for Janet? Was there a genuine romantic connection? How did she feel about him?
Janet fell in love with Des. Since the death of her husband, she'd not fallen into despair or anything, but she's just been very, very lonely. Family's one thing, but a life partner is something else. And when Des came along and paid attention to her and complimented her and brought her small gifts, it was for her a kind of reawakening of, I guess, the passions she'd had earlier in her life. Des knew who she was. Des knew how much she was worth. And by this stage, Des had always had a liking for the high life. For instance, while he was dating Janet, he took a former girlfriend down to Melbourne for a weekend where they stayed at the Windsor Hotel, and the bill for the alcohol alone for the Saturday evening meal was over $1,000. So he liked spending money big. Unfortunately, he did not earn that kind of money. He saw Janet as probably the best chance he had to re-establish himself financially, that if he could marry her, share a life with her, he'd have access to the best part of it, at least $500,000 if they split it down the middle. But he'd have access to her wealth, which would support him. And he'd never had any trouble at all convincing one woman that she was the one in his life, all the while seeing girl after woman after girl. So for Des, Janet was a very, very desirable target. For Janet, Des was a potential love in her life.
Where did that high roller sort of taste and behaviour come from with Des? Why was it that he was this guy who could blow $1,000 on a dinner and was seemingly obsessed with finding a woman to bankroll this lifestyle?
My reading of Des is that he always felt he was better than those around him, but he equally always felt that his superiority wasn't recognised by most people or rewarded by those in a position to reward him. When he was a Victorian policeman, he was bone lazy. He cut every corner he could. When he was in the drug squad, he took money from drug dealers. He took drugs from drug dealers to sell them to fund a lifestyle that he believed his intellect and his achievements entitled him to. Now, objectively, he was badly wrong, but he wasn't the first and won't be the last person to think the world owes me something because I'm who I am. The potential windfall from Janet, and as I said, she was one of many lovers he'd had over the years, but the potential windfall from Janet was far in excess of anything he'd seen before, hence his determination to pursue her. Her family were aware of the rumours. They didn't know that Janet and Des were an item until Janet chose to introduce him to them at a family function at her home one night, and they were all aghast. He made no effort whatsoever to either interact with them or, more tellingly, to interact with her. And the family felt embarrassed for her more than anything.
Is that anecdote indicative of what we know their relationship was like? How did Des treat her? How did he speak of Janet to others?
Des did not want people to know that he was having an affair, a liaison with Janet. And whenever anyone asked him about rumours that he was seeing her, he would use really derogatory terms. Whereas to her, he would say, "You're the love of my life, you're the light of my life, we need to be together." But he was always very aware of physical appearance of women of all ages, and he wanted to be seen as a handsome man about town who could basically pick up any woman he chose, particularly the attractive ones. With his assessment of Janet being that she was not attractive, and that was a very, very subjective assessment, he didn't want to be associated with her because he felt she was below the standards that he'd set for himself. So whenever he was asked about her, the replies were always derogatory and quite petty and harmful.
In contrast to Des, Janet's been described as a really kind person, wouldn't hurt a fly. What can you tell me about her personality?
I've spoken to people who knew Janet, including her family, and she was one of those ladies that is just a joy to be around. She takes an interest in people, in what they're doing. To some, she may have been a bit over inquisitive, but it was never, she didn't pry. She was genuinely interested in how other people coping with their lives. One of the anecdotes I heard was that if she walked down the street in Deniliquin's, not a particularly big town, and she lived close to the main street, she walked down the main street to buy something. She would stop at every shop between where she was heading for and home just to call in and see how people were going. She was loved by her family and loved by a lot of people she worked with. The only consistent criticism I heard of her was that she was a bit naive and too trusting, particularly in her dealings with Des. She wasn't manipulated by other people. She had a very good family network. She had a very good lawyer. She had a very good financial advisor. But when it came to Des, she had a massive blind spot, which he identified and which he manipulated.
Is that the theme throughout the stories of the women that Des has tried to manipulate or scam, that there's this sort of blind spot for the women who fall for him, that there's this naivety? How is it that he is able to convince these women to trust him?
To begin with, he's a tall man. He's a handsome man. He's a man that dresses well, that knows that he makes a good first impression, and he really utilises that and uses it to put himself in a dominant position in the relationship. Early on in all the relationships he has, he showers affection on the object of his attentions. He sends little notes. He will buy flowers and chocolates and champagne. And a lot of the women he met, because he was a regular online dating site attendee, a lot of them in that scene, it was about sex, it wasn't about long-term relationships. And the ones that he had relationships with, many of them recognised it for what it was and recognised him for what he was. And again, amongst the people I knew who spoke to him, the number of women who said he was a player just struck me as quite extraordinary. And I think the more sophisticated women he dealt with saw him for what he was, and if they were in it just for the same as him, just for a short-term physical relationship, it didn't worry them at all. The ones who tried to get into a longer-term relationship with eventually realised who he was, what he was, and the relationship would end.
Is it fair to assume he was not faithful to Janet through their relationship? Do we know for sure?
Yeah, we do know for sure. I mentioned the trip to the Windsor Hotel in Melbourne took place after they agreed that they were engaged. She didn't tell her family, but he kind of celebrated the consummation of their relationship by going to Melbourne to consummate another relationship. And that went on. And two more examples are he decided they'd marry, went and saw a marriage celebrant in Echuca, said this is what he wanted, then phoned back and said, no, it's off. My fiance's betrayed me. Then a couple of months later, it was on again. And he took Janet down to Echuca to meet the celebrant and to have a look at the venue where they'd marry. And the celebrant, who was a mature, very smart woman, said she's never felt as uncomfortable as she did meeting them, because Des treated Janet like she was a piece of furniture. She had no say in any of the arrangements. And yet, while he was doing that, the celebrant felt he was sizing me up. He was looking at me like a piranha would look at a bit of meat dropped in the water. That she felt uncomfortable, physically uncomfortable, when he came close to her. And that was the response of a lot of mature women I spoke to, women who'd seen a lot of life, just did not like the look of him one bit.
In terms of their wedding, they, as you mentioned, became engaged after a few years of dating. Why was Janet's family kept in the dark about the wedding? What do we know about that point in time?
What we know is that Des hated them. They loathed him and he hated them. So he wanted nothing whatsoever to do with them. He would say from the time he was introduced to them until many years later when asked about them, his whole response was to call them interfering pricks. And he tried to cut them out of Janet's life because I think he recognised what they thought of him. And because she was so close to her sisters in particular, he did not want to run the risk of losing Janet because her family pull was much stronger than anything he could counteract it with. So by cutting off or limiting her access to her family, especially by telling her, don't let them know we're going to get married, that was the buffer he used to keep them at a distance that I think had from early after they became an item, had he allowed Janet to tell her family that they planned to marry, it wouldn't have happened. I think the pressure from her family would have been so great that sooner or later she would have buckled to it.
So by the time Des and Janet are married, whether or not their relationship has the blessing of Janet's family, they are now, legally bound together. At what point did Janet change her will?
Her original will she changed after Frank died, and I suspect before she became intimate with Des, changed it to leave everything to her son Stephen. Then after they married, she changed it again to basically leave half to her son and half to Des. The financial advisor and lawyer got together a bit on that. They had their own suspicions about Des and what he wanted from Janet and advised her, yes, you can do that, but why don't you set the first $100,000 in your will aside for your son and then divide the rest of the will 50-50. So put up $100,000 so Stephen's looked after right from the start and then they can both have half the estate. And she agreed to that. It was a bit of a victory for her family. Her family actually still didn't know until that happened. Even her financial advisor and lawyer didn't know that she married Des, and they were very, very concerned, I think is probably the best word.
Where was Stephen in all of this, Janet's son? Did Des ever show any interest in maybe connecting with him, playing the role of a father figure as his stepfather?
No, Des had no time for him at all, and it was a feeling that was rescinded by the usual, teenagers who get sulky about everything. Stephen was very close to his father and his mother, and I think was very, very aggrieved at Des stepping into his mother's life. I'm not certain he was old enough to recognise the kind of sinister nature of Des's interests, but he was old enough to understand that this was a man that was taking his mother away from him, and he wasn't comfortable with that at all. Stephen had very, very few and minor interactions with Des, because once they were married, Des moved on to another level in his planning, and what he wanted to do was, okay, the family don't know we're married, but we're in Deniliquin. He wanted to get Janet away from her family, which meant taking her away from Deniliquin, and he did that by applying for and being granted a transfer with the New South Wales Ambulance Service to Helensburgh, halfway between Sydney and Wollongong on the Princess Highway.
Janet and Des had been largely living apart after that transfer came through. Is that correct?
Yeah, Des pretty much went straight up to Sydney, but he'd convinced Janet that that's where their future was. He'd also convinced her that what they should do is sell everything they had in Deniliquin to buy something nice up around where he'd be working. And it was an idea that Janet went along with. They went up to Helensburgh for a weekend and went to an estate agent there, and Des had already spoken to her about what they were looking for, and she'd selected two properties for them to look at, two properties that fitted the description of what Des said he wanted. One was at Helensburgh on the new development on the outskirts of town. It was a fairly new home, and it was floor-to-ceiling windows across the back, so it was full of light and airy. The owners had put a nice swimming pool in just off the veranda at the back, and Janet at the time said to the estate agent, "Look, this is just heavenly. I could live here forever." It had views, it had everything. The second one was at a place called Otford, which was just down the road from Helensburgh, and it was a bush block. It was basically a double block, still quite heavily timbered, with a multi-level home on it. Nice home, modern home, but it was surrounded by forests. You couldn't see the neighbours' homes because of the trees, and in fact you couldn't see the road it was built on because of the trees. Now, after they'd seen both of them, Des said to the estate agent, a woman named Marilyn, "We'll take the second one, we'll take the Otford property." There was no discussions with Janet, there was no negotiating, even though, and Marilyn had told Des this, the price that they were asking for the Otford property was probably a bit over what it should have been. Des didn't bat an eyelid. "We'll take it." Then said to Janet, "You've got the credit card, pay a holding deposit and we'll move forward from here." So that was the kind of manipulative person he was. And it was interesting to me that when I spoke to Marilyn, she had the same response as the wedding celebrant, that she just felt that he was sizing her up all the time, that he was undressing her with his eyes and almost licking his lips in anticipation. And she was very, very uncomfortable around him. She thought Janet was wonderful. So, yeah, they bought quite a lovely property at Otford.
Before Janet had even moved in, she's tying up her loose ends in Deniliquin, preparing to relocate, to live in this home with her new husband, presumably, hoping for a happy life there. He had already had another woman over into that home. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah, it was a European woman, or a woman born in Europe, a very attractive Croatian woman. He'd struck up a relationship with her some years previously, and she lived in Sydney. So as soon as they bought the property or settled on the property and he was living in it, he invited her down for a week. He had some other female contacts up there, and he started getting in touch with them as well. I remember one of the stories was Des told Janet that he couldn't come down to Deniliquin because his brother in Victoria had been in a bad accident, was in a coma, and he had to go down to Victoria to spend time with his family down there. And Janet, all concerned and naive, said, "Oh, yes, Des, do what you have to do." What Des did was went away with the Croatian girl to the central coast of New South Wales, where her family had a holiday house, and spent the weekend and a bit with her there. But at the same time as he was seeing her, he was rekindling a relationship with a former nurse that he hadn't seen for 20 years. And he was saying to her, "I think, you and I should get together at some stage." And she was married, he was married, but again, there was never any mention of other relationships. That another consistent theme through all of this is the women that Des was with were not aware that he was married, that he had been married, that he had a daughter from his first marriage, that he was seeing other women. He was very protective of his privacy. He would tell them, "Do not ever try and contact me at work. If we need to speak, I will initiate that conversation." He would snap at any woman who suggested, "Well, I'd like to get in touch with you, I'd like to do this, I'd like that to happen." It will not happen. I will determine how our relationship develops. And it was that coercive control. He was just a serial seducer and a serial manipulator of women.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Emma Gillespie. I'm speaking with author Ian Shaw about the murder of Janet Fisicaro. Ian, I want to jump to Easter 2005. Up until this point, Des's crimes have existed in, the grey of a morally corrupt sort of a person, aside from fraud and possible financial oversteps or crimes. But everything is about to change when he heads to the Royal National Park for a camping trip with Janet. Was it out of character for Janet to go camping?
It was very much out of character for Janet to go camping. It was very much out of character for her to go bushwalking. Des was an experienced bushwalker and camper, and because he was a paramedic, his training would involve abseiling and lots of rescue scenarios. But early in the year, he bought a 2-man tent and 2 sleeping bags, and an emergency beacon, things that didn't really fit in with the lifestyle that he'd been living or the lifestyle that he told people he expected to live. Over the New Year period of 2005, he'd invited lots of people to come and stay with him before Janet moved down to Otford. But as Easter approached, the week before Easter, Janet, still in Deniliquin and having sold both her home there and an investment property that she'd put some money into, Des arrived in Deniliquin middle of the week. They started packing up everything. All her stuff went into plastic bags to take up to Otford. The night before they left, Janet contacted her family, her mother in particular, and I think one of her sisters and perhaps her brother were having dinner at her mother's place, to tell them that A, I'm married to Des Campbell, and B, we're going to Sydney tomorrow because we're going to live in Sydney. So total bolt from the blue. That was the week before Easter. They'd been in their new home together. Des had been there for 4 months. Janet arrived, and 4 days after they arrived, Des said, we're going on a camping trip this weekend. And it was the Easter weekend. Thursday we'll head off. There's a beautiful campsite in the Royal National Park, which was about 5 kilometres from where they lived. I've got a tent. We'll take some supplies. You'll love it. There's a campsite with superb views. It's got showers. It's got toilets. It's got barbecues. We'll have the time of our lives there. And that seems to be how he described it to her, because that was how she described the opportunity to members of the family when she told them that's what we're doing. They, after the phone call, were just amazed that she'd never shown any interest in camping. She'd never shown any interest in bushwalking. The walking track they were going on ran alongside some very steep cliffs down to the edge of the ocean there. She was afraid of heights, so it just didn't ring true. Now, they headed out mid-afternoon on what should have been about an hour and a half, perhaps, hike to a nice little camping spot, but they didn't get there. Des said Janet felt tired. She was struggling a bit because there were steep sections, and out of concern for her, because he was fairly fit or very fit, he said, I picked a spot where we could camp. It was away from the track, but it was in amongst a small little clump of trees and shrubs. It was about 15 metres or so from the edge of the cliffs, but it was sheltered and it was private. And he said, so we went over there. I put the tent up. We watched the sun go down. We had a meal and a bottle of water. Then we decided we'd go to sleep and decide what we're going to do the next morning. That was Des's story.
You mentioned the camping spot that they were supposed to head to, or that Janet thought they would be heading to, somewhere comfortable with a bathroom block, amenities, shower. What was the reality of the spot that did eventually get chosen? And how did Janet meet her demise?
Des was perfectly correct when he claimed later that he chose a spot that was protected and private, because it was at least 100 metres across grasslands with shrubs to a copse of trees overlooking or just on the edge of the cliff. He went on to say that they went to bed early, and shortly afterwards, and couldn't have been dark for too long, he said, Janet said, I need to go to the toilet. So she went outside and he said, I was just in there drifting off to sleep. And he thought he heard something that sounded like, or oh, and then nothing. And after a while, a minute perhaps, he thought, there's something wrong here. So he said he got out of the tent and looked around and went towards the edge of the cliff and couldn't see her anywhere and thought, I bet she's fallen off. He'd taken in his backpack a length of rope, ostensibly to practice his abseiling. So he said he went along the edge of the cliff till he could find a spot where he could climb down, and then went along the rock ledge at the bottom of the cliff, and right below where they'd camped, he found her body wedged between two large rocks, and he said she was dead. And he said, at first I thought she was alive, but then when I got closer and saw the terrible wounds, I realised she was dead. He said the waves were starting to break towards where the body was. So he said, I had the emergency beacon with me, coincidentally. So I activated the beacon and then sat there trying to protect her body from the waves. Now, the beacon was activated, so all these things are recorded at about 7:30 in the evening. But because it was an outdated model that he hadn't paid a lot for, it took quite a while for the emergency services to react to this beacon being activated. In fact, it wasn't until close to 10:30 that a rescue helicopter arrived with their searchlight, spotted Des and the body of Janet, winched the body and Des back up and flew to St George Hospital, where she was pronounced dead on arrival. Des was full of mea culpas and, oh, my life is over, oh, misery me. Some of those, like an ambulance driver and an attendant, thought it was a bit over the top. But the police who arrived to take a statement not long afterwards thought he is pretty upset. Left it at that. Janet's body was held at the hospital. Des was given a lift home in an ambulance. The ambulance driver thought he was sometimes really sad and other times not so sad. And one other time made the statement, apropos of absolutely nothing, I guess I'll have to sell the house now. So that was Janet's demise. She died from massive injuries. She had severe head injuries, a lot of fractures and a lot of internal injuries. She would have died very quickly. There's no joy in any of this story, but she would have died quickly.
At what point did police start to suspect that Des was lying, that it wasn't perhaps that Janet had met a terrible accident trying to go to the bathroom in the dark, but in fact that he may have pushed her?
I think the very next day, the afternoon, he was interviewed by police, by detectives, and again he was crying, he was blaming himself, and it was just a little bit too over the top for the detectives. They thought, yeah, look, newlyweds, you would be upset, but it's beyond grief. It's almost overacting. And in fact, the chaplain from the ambulance service came down to visit Des twice in the next 3 days. And he didn't think he was overacting. He thought he was a man just so totally destroyed by grief that he couldn't function properly. Des's brother Neil came up from Victoria and he felt the same, that Des was drinking heavily, was crying. That was all an act. While he was trying to convince the world that he's this grieving husband who has no reason to go on living without the love of his life, he was organising weeks away in Townsville with the Croatian girl. He was looking at Janet's insurance policy. He was phoning Marilyn, the estate agent, inquiring about selling the home, how much he'd get for it, speaking to his own lawyer, asking the lawyer to access Janet's will and give him a figure of what he could really expect as a payout from the will, doing all those things, but doing them behind the facade of whenever anyone was there, oh my, my life is over type thing. So it was basically an over-representation of grief by a man who thought he was getting away with it and was planning what he would do with the money. The police weren't happy with the way he presented himself, and they were even less happy when their forensic detectives or the forensic squad examined the scene where they'd camped. The ranger who accompanied them said he could not think of a worse place to camp. It was an area Des was familiar with. As I said, he was a bushwalker. He'd been through there before. The police and the rangers looked at the site. It wasn't a straight drop-off. There was an angle down to the edge of the cliff. They found a footprint, one of Janet's footprints, near the edge of the cliff, and they found a shrub that overhung that edge of the cliff with a branch that had been broken off. And they looked at the angles and decided that if someone had been walking down that angle, which increased significantly for the last metre or two, they would have been able to stop. They would have been able to use their feet to stop before they got to the steep bit and went off the edge. The only way they couldn't have stopped themselves was if they tripped or they were pushed. And there was no indication that Janet had tripped. There was nothing really for her to trip over. And they thought it was more rather than less likely that she'd been pushed. And the only person capable of pushing her in the area to push her was her husband, Des. So almost immediately a strike force, salt water, was formed, and a couple of detectives were assigned to the case. They conducted wide-ranging interviews in Deniliquin, in Melbourne. At one stage, two of them flew to England, flew to Surrey and spoke to the police there about his behaviour when he was a UK policeman, and were strongly of the opinion that Des had murdered Janet.
Were there any other indicators of premeditation? Do we know if Des was inspired by any other similar crimes? Is this something he'd ever spoken of?
Des had studied earlier a case in England, a similar case where a woman had fallen off a cliff while walking with her husband. He inherited a £500,000 insurance policy. There were no witnesses, and while it was proved that the husband was a serial womanizer and in some financial stress, because there were no witnesses and the forensics were 50-50, he was found not guilty of murder. He claimed she slipped and fell because if it was a suicide, the insurance policy would have been voided. And they knew that Des had studied up on that case, on both the forensics and the financial implications of suicide versus murder versus accident. So they felt that he'd murdered her. They looked for something that would tip it over the edge of balance of probabilities into, yes, we can charge this man, but nothing was there. So for 2 years, Des lived a life as if nothing had ever gone wrong for him. It would come unstuck, but before it came unstuck, Des had remarried, had 2 children. He'd transferred with the ambulance service from Helensburgh down to Barmer, which is not all that far from Deniliquin, and we're living there keeping a very, very low profile.
So what was the breakthrough? What was it that eventually made this case come unstuck?
There was a case in Sydney of another death by falling from a cliff at the Gap in Sydney near South Head, and the forensics in there convinced a jury that the woman who died had been pushed. And that was a bit of a pick-me-up for the Saltwater Task Force or Strike Force detectives. And they brought the physics professor who'd given evidence in that case in to look at what they had. And he was very, very strongly of the opinion that Janet had been pushed. While that was bubbling away, an inquest into her death was held. And at the inquest, her family gave evidence. There was forensic evidence from the police. There was specialist evidence. There was evidence from the marriage celebrant, from the estate agent, from his next-door neighbour that painted a very unsavoury picture of Des. The post-mortem had shown bruises on her upper arms that appeared to be, the pathologist said, where a very strong man has held her tightly by the top of her arms, and the supposition was he then pushed her down this increasingly steep slope. They identified a point of no return where if she hadn't stopped by this point, she couldn't stop at all, and it was maybe 3 or 4 metres short of the edge of the cliff. And her footprint was just before the point of no return, so it looked like she'd jammed her foot down to try and stop, and he'd pushed her so hard and judged it so professionally that once he pushed her with that force, she was always going off the edge of the cliff. The inquest was terminated early, with the coroner finding that there was a person of interest who could be found liable of charges based on the evidence presented. Again, nothing happened for, I guess it'd be another 18 months, 2 years. Then in October 2009, Des was formally charged with the murder of Janet Campbell.
I want to focus on Janet's family for a second. How were they over this time? Did they have suspicions? Was it when Des skipped out on Janet's funeral that their concerns really ramped up?
Yes, I think the family suspected the moment they learnt that Janet had died that she'd been killed by Des. They were not sophisticated in terms of understanding police procedures, coronial procedures, the way the law works in New South Wales and elsewhere. And they, I think, believed right from the start, Des murdered our sister, our daughter, our sister. The police will find that out and he will be charged. The fact that Des wanted her body cremated immediately with no one but himself and an old army friend at the funeral or at the cremation, when the family learnt of that, the family had to be notified, and they just said, no, she'll be buried in Deniliquin. And as she was buried in the same grave as her first husband, Frank Fisicaro. And Des didn't turn up at the funeral, partly because I think he believed he'd be ridiculed and perhaps physically threatened, but partly because he wanted to go away with another one of the girlfriends. So the family had their suspicions all along that he was after Janet for her money, but equally they believed that Janet would see through that and come to her senses. And even though she'd sold the places in Deniliquin, the family firmly believed that within, they thought, 3 to 6 months, she'd see through Des, say, I'm not living with you, I'm not living this kind of life, and return to Deniliquin. Her death was a shock to them, but to be brutally honest, I'm not certain it was totally out of the blue.
6 years after Janet's death, Des is found guilty. What can you tell me about that day?
The prosecution was conducted by Mark Tedeschi, senior counsel, who's quite renowned as a prosecutor, and he did a job par excellence. He walked the jury through motive. He walked the jury through Des's background. He had the jury visit the campsite and where Janet had gone off the cliff. They were fitted with safety harnesses so they could test themselves going down the incline, all those things. And the professor, his name was Rod Cross, gave forensic evidence that left very little doubt as to what had happened. And with the bruises on the arm, they were brought up. The defence said, could those bruises have occurred when she hit something as she was falling down the cliff face? And the answer was, yes, they could have. The fact was, I don't think she did hit anything going down the cliff face. Her body was found quite a distance out from the base of the cliff. And if she was pushed and hit the edge of the cliff at any speed, her body was found where you'd expect it to be found. A lot of evidence was offered up about Des's lifestyle, his manipulative character, what he'd done in the past. In all, 45 witnesses were called for the prosecution. The defence relied very much on, okay, Des is a cad. He's a gold digger, a money grabber. He only sees women in terms of manipulation and outcomes in his favour. But there are lots of men out there like that, and that doesn't make a person a murderer. And that was the point at which the jury retired, and The jury actually asked to go back to the campsite and examine it once more. Shortly afterwards said it wasn't unanimous. The judge said, I'll give you another chance to make it unanimous. It was 11-1, and they came back, I think it was about an hour later, and said, yeah, unanimous verdict of guilty. Summing up, the judge gave Des character assessment that was 100% accurate, that he was an ogre. He was a person who viewed the world through the prism of self-interest, self-benefit. He was amoral rather than immoral, that he had no real morality attached to it. It was all about himself. And then proceeded to sentence him to life imprisonment with a minimum of 24 years to be followed by 9 years on parole. Now, Des was born in 1958. He was sentenced in 2010. So basically, if he comes out, he'll be a very old man.
Did he ever show any remorse?
No. Des would not show remorse over anything. Like I said, he's amoral rather than immoral. I suspect on a spectrum, the psychiatric disorders spectrum, he'd probably fit the profile of a sociopath, a narcissistic sociopath. I'd probably characterise him best as that.
My last question for you, Ian, having worked so thoroughly on this and knowing people who knew Janet themselves, can you speak to the sense of relief after 6 years of trying to hold this man to account, so much circumstantial evidence? Was there a huge sense of relief when justice was eventually served?
I think there was a sense of relief, but it was tinged by, I think it was her brother Kevin summed it up by saying, we're here outside the courtroom. He's going away for the rest of his life. We'll walk away from here, but Janet won't. We'll never see her again. So, yes, it was relief that justice had been done and had been seen to be done. It vindicated their belief from the time they met Des. But, the tragedy of it all was a perfectly normal, ordinary, compassionate, caring woman died so an extremely manipulative man could live the kind of life that he believed he was entitled to. So I think at the back of everyone's minds was that fact that, yes, he's gone, he won't be coming back, but she's gone forever. So, it was one of those bittersweet moments.
Thanks to Ian for his assistance in telling this story today. And if you'd like to learn more about his books or hear his previous True Crime Conversations episode about Melbourne's Brownout Strangler, you'll find links in our episode descriptions. And while you have your favourite podcast app open, make sure you're following True Crime Conversations so you'll know every time a new episode drops. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast produced by me, Emma Gillespie, with our executive producer, Gia Moylan. Our audio design is by Rhiannon Mooney. Thank you so much for listening to today's ep. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.